the Canadians playing hockey against the Soviet Union, and it got to the fourth quarter, and the Canadians just dropped off. They just died, and the Soviet team just did not seem to skip a beat. And so, in response to this, what happened was the Canadians thought, well, what we're going to do is we're going to have a concerted effort to improve our fitness. So they really went to town on that. They really worked on their fitness, really improved, played the Soviets again, and exactly the same thing happened. There didn't seem to be any kind of change, and they couldn't really understand why. So they went back and they thought, well, we obviously didn't get fit enough. We obviously need to get even fitter. And they got their VO2 maxes so good that they actually were comparable with cross-country skiers. They went into the next game of the Soviets, no effect. It just didn't seem to have any kind of bearing. Got to the fourth quarter, they were dead, and the Soviets were still going strong. And I think it was after the fall of the Iron Curtain, a lot of information started to come across, and they found out what these guys had actually been doing, and they hadn't been focusing on fitness. What they'd been focusing on was pure skating speed, and they'd been trying to get their skating as fast as possible. And what it did was it created this effect where you didn't actually have to be as fit, because your 70% was totally different to someone 70% who wasn't as fast as you. And that's what they were playing at. So this is effectively a speed reserve, and this is something that you can do if you do pure speed work with your players. Is you'll actually find that you'll get significant fitness increases anyway. So for most team sports, they'll get a VO2 max that will be quite impressive if you train them something like a sprinter. But they'll also have this speed reserve if you actually can increase their top speed or their acceleration. So his 60% is going to be your 100%. And if you manage to stay with him for 20 minutes, at the end of that 20 minutes, you're fried. And it's not necessarily that he's fitter than you. It's just that he has that ceiling that you just can't even reach. So this is something that I've found from practical experience, that focusing on flogging players often makes them tired, often makes them under recovered, and it often makes them not enjoy the game or the training. But if you can, and there's also an injury risk with too much conditioning, whereas if you can improve speed, you'll get this endurance solution. If you were going to condition people for the demands of this, so say this was going to happen, or at least as a worst case scenario, you're expecting that it could happen, what do you think about the physical demands the players are under when they're off the ball? There's guys with hands on their hips, there's guys walking. What's the physical demand of that sort of restructuring? Because what will happen is some people will take, this was 3 minutes, and they will translate that into 3 minutes flogging, or 3 minutes sprinting, or 3 minutes wrestling. And the moment you try and do that, you're not really replicating the demands of the game. You're going to lose intensity because you cannot do that for 3 minutes. You're going to actually expose them to the risks of injury, even while you're protecting them against it. So rather than thinking of 3 minutes worst case scenario as being 3 minutes of sprinting and wrestling, it's 3 minutes that involve sprinting and wrestling. Even if you were to make a small-sided game where you were doing something like 5-on-5 or 6-on-6, the amount of participation opportunities would go up so much that you would be sprinting and wrestling more for that worst case scenario. So you would actually have to maybe change the time if you were making it a small-sided worst case scenario. We'll come into the volume and intensity side of it a bit later. If you watch what the guys are doing off the ball, it's no longer intense. It's still work, they're still focused, they're still having to make decisions, they're still having to reposition, but it's you're not preparing them for something intense. That's just general conditioning. Like in that little spell we watched, it ended in a try. If you condition your players for this, it will end with you scoring the try, most likely. If you don't condition your players for it, it might end with some of them getting an injury because they don't have the capacity to deal with those sorts of demands. Think about ball in play time and think about appropriate doses. So a lot of things now they come from things like wrestling and jiu-jitsu, and they put them into the rugby. Now, if I'm in a situation in the wrestling sport, I might have to do that skill for 3 minutes, 5 minutes. I might have to put someone on the floor and then make sure they don't get off the floor or they're going to eat me. But if you take that skill out of wrestling and you put it into rugby, I only need to use that skill for 10 seconds. So make sure that the dosages of the skills that you put in the game, the ball in play, it's appropriate to actual game and not necessarily that 3 minutes or that 2 minutes, whatever your ball in play time is or your worst case scenario time for your team is. Another thing to think about is the injury prevention side of it. So it's not just that if you don't get your ball in play times right, that the skill's no longer relevant and the intensity is no longer relevant, but you also might get people injured because they're trying to do 3 minutes of repeat sprints or they're trying to do 3 minutes of wrestling. And that's when people are going to unnecessarily hurt hamstrings or injure shoulders because you're trying to condition them for something that is just, it's not actually relevant to the demands of the game, even though the time on the surface is perfect time. Think about the demands of the sport in terms of things like wrestling. So if you were to come up with a worst case scenario for rugby and say you decided that your ball in play time is 1 minute 30 seconds on average, so you're going to generate a worst case scenario that's about 2 minutes. If I was to make that pure running, it doesn't really factor in the calorific demands of wrestling. And if you were to take another sport like basketball and you were to factor and make it purely running or over focused on running, does it really factor in the demands of jumping and how taxing jumping can be? So you need to think about your sport, and you need to think about it's not just about getting the time right; it's about covering the major motor skills in a kind of hierarchy of importance. On paper, like coaches might think contact is contact, but it really isn't. It really depends on your sport, and it really depends on the type of contact. It really depends on the type of jump. So it's not just a case of having one of these repetition sprint jog, sprint jog, sprint jog, sprint jog type programs where you're incorporating the time that you need. You actually have to think about what are the most taxing skills, how often are they going to come up, and getting that kind of balance. If you make it a game, those things will probably come up quite organically anyway. But when you move away from the game, you don't get a realistic balance.
Yeah.
So I think there's a place for it if it's a skill, but if you've got developing players and you're doing something that there is some risk involved, it's not just a skill. There's like wear and tear,
Yep.
there's mechanical risks, there's tissue risks, and that the moment that skill starts to deteriorate, you're exposing them to doing it messily. That's when it's a real problem.
Yep.
The other side of it is also if you're thinking of it from a perspective of are you actually trying to develop a particular energy system? If you exceed the demands of the game, that's when you start to get rubbish in return.
Yep.
You don't have the intensity because you've exceeded the demands of what they actually need to be able to do. And you don't get, and that's what the stories I get from a lot of the guys I talk to in Ireland, where they have the GAA coaches who flog the shit out of these guys, and they say, oh, they're not fit, they're not fit, they're not fit, and they're arriving at the session exhausted. So they're never actually over retrained; they're just constantly under recovered.
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, it depends, but like for what we're talking about, like yeah, we really want to replicate the low that they need to be good at. These are her Olympic golds, and these are her world records. So she got 14 world records, and she got the Olympic gold in the 1, the 2, and the 4. And she is the only sprinter to have done this. No other sprinter has ever won the 100, the 200, and the 400. But just bearing in mind, she'd gone into retirement, then she came back out of retirement, and then she spent 2 years just concentrating on the 4. And previously, in like 1956, there wasn't a 400 meters. If you expose someone to a volume that isn't relevant to the intensity you need, you don't really get either. You just get someone who's not tired at the end of the game, but didn't really get to express himself. So that for me is Betty Cuthbert is the exception that proves the rule. Even someone as gifted as Bolt, he didn't get to do the 400. None of the 60 guys are on the 100 list. No, I mean, to be fair, you don't know what could have happened with them if they hadn't had the drug bans and things like that. These guys, they do make the 100 and 200, but they don't feature in the 4. And then a guy like Michael Johnson, he doesn't feature in the 1. He largely trained his 400-meter runners by doing repetition 300s. And so he didn't even expose them to the distance as an endurance modality that they actually needed for their race. They still would have run 400s, they still would have timed 400s, but the conditioning requirement came more from repetition 300s because he found that it was less demanding on them. So this is Darren Clark's time, which I think pretty sure is still Australian record. It's a pretty respectable 400 time, and if you think that came from working on 300s, really that's what it is. If you're designing your small-sided game, is think about volume and intensity. Think about, are you actually trying to expose them to more volume to make them more conditioned for something that they don't actually need to be conditioned for? Because I've seen it time and time again that the guys that do the small-sided games, they aren't flogged at the end of the game. They still have intensity. Ruben's seen it from my videos. If you're in a situation where you're at a low level where guys are never going to go to 3 minutes, there's no point exposing them to something like 5 minutes, because A, you're going to lose intensity, and B, you're going to increase the chance of injury. If you go down that line, you'll find those guys are tired at the end of the game anyway, because although they're conditioned for a 5-minute game, when they're experiencing the 1 minute 20 games that are constantly interrupted by a referee blowing the whistle over a mistake, they don't have conditioning for that. So they might be fitter for a 5-minute game, but they're not playing that. And it's specific endurance. Ruben and Neil particularly talked about with that 3-minute passage with the Highlanders against the Chiefs, is all those things that they were seeing that you needed to be able to do, those are in a game anyway. Whereas conditioning for the sake of conditioning, it doesn't build those skills. It doesn't give them the opportunity to have a visual stimulus that's relevant and react accordingly. So it's all in the game. So there's no reason to overcomplicate it. I think it's a mistake to outcondition superior skill or superior mechanics. So if you look at Bolt at the end of that race, he was a bit of a mess. He actually said something along the lines of, that's very different to a sprint race. He didn't even see it as a sprint as far as he was concerned. It was something quite different. But even with that poor conditioning, look how poor relatively, look how much he beat all those other guys in the wet. So that just incredible mechanical efficiency. You can't outcondition that. So if you can improve someone's mechanical ability, or if you can improve their skills, not only is it more efficient from a conditioning point of view, you'll have that sort of like endurance illusion that we spoke about, but you don't expose them to the risks of injury and the wear and tear that you get from excess conditioning. In fact, you mitigate their problems. Are you conditioning for a demand that's required? That's something that you want to think about. So are you trying to turn your Coleman into a Butch Reynolds? Don't do it. Think about gains and energy systems. So think about what do you need to develop, and are you actually giving them the recovery that they need to develop that? So it's not just the length of your games, is the length of your timing that you're allowing them to rest. Is that appropriate as well? I think this is something you really want to think about, is dose the hand that you're dealt, not what the textbook says. So if you have a very clear idea of what the glycolytic demand is, or the anaerobic demand, or anything like that, but you have players that actually, they're not quite up to that yet, or they've come out of lockdown and they've been playing video games and they don't have the same baseline, that a 14-year-old would normally have. Think, okay, what do they actually do at the moment? What can they actually do, have some success at, and the intensity doesn't drop off, and maybe then build up. So if
Yeah.
you're what I was doing last time was a 2-minute game, I won't start at that now. I'd like to start at a 1-minute game and see how they do. And they'll be telling me when they want to do a 2-minute game. This is a real simple way that I like to break down my games: speed, ball in play, worst case scenario. And I find that if you're covering those three bases, you get the intensity and the conditioning that you need. It's a very simple way of thinking about it. It doesn't require technology. It doesn't really require thinking about like different energy systems, which actually operate on a continuum anyway. You can't really separate out the energy systems.